Let's look at why an Austrian monk called Gregor Mendel is very important for the understanding of genetics. They sometimes call him the father of genetics. So yes, he was a monk who was also basically like a scientist, and that's not unusual at the time because the only people who really had free time were the clergy. And so he was really interested in gardening and then looking at the traits of the organisms that he was breeding and crossing. In this case, it was pea plants. And he started counting what the parent plants look like and then counting their offspring and how many of each type of offspring features or characteristics they got. So if you had two different color parent plants, like their flowers were different colors, then he counted in the offspring plants, after he specifically pollinated those two parents together, which types of flower colors the offspring were and in what proportion. So he counted thousands and thousands of offspring, which is really what allowed him to make some conclusions about inheritance. They didn't know anything about genes back then, or DNA or chromosomes, so he's just making these inferences based off these counting these numbers. So some of his most important results were that if he crossed a purple flower pea plant with a white flower pea plant, he got all purple flower offspring plants. Now that in itself could suggest that the purple did away with the white color of the flower. Somehow purple took it over. But what he did, which was the key experiment here, is he crossed these purple plants to each other. So the offspring, he then pollinated, cross-pollinated those plants. And what he found was he got mostly purple flower plants. But he also found, and this is the key, that he got some white flower plants. And in fact, he got a specific ratio. For every 3 purple flowers, he got about 1 white flower. So when he did the calculations. In other words, 3/4 of the plants were purple and 1/4 of the plants were white. And what this told him was that the white didn't go away. It was not blended away. It was not taken over forever by the purple. Somehow the white was still there. And so the white flower color and the purple flower color were discrete, individual entities. They must be physical entities that can be passed from parents to offspring because they're still there even when you can't see them. So some of his most important conclusions: traits or characteristics are coded by discrete units that are passed on. He also saw that traits can be hidden, right? That white flower color in appearance, but the genetics are still there because it can come back. For example, that white flower color. So that white flower color genetics, we'll call it, in the first generation of all purple plants, it was hidden. So those are what we call recessive traits. And then he called the other ones dominant traits, the ones that can do the hiding. That has nothing to do whether they're more or less common. It just has to do whether they can be hidden or whether they can't be hidden. Okay. Based off his calculations, he could also tell that there were 2 copies of each gene. We would call that 2 alleles. An allele is a version of a gene. So he saw that you can have the same variant, the same allele for both copies of your gene. So that is called being homozygous. Homo means same. Zygous refers to what's called a zygote, which is the first cell after fertilization, the first cell of the new organism when the egg and the sperm combine nuclei. Let's box recessive traits and dominant traits so that you know what those are. And this is homozygous. He also knew that they can have different, and these little quote things means can have. It's the same words as above. You're not familiar. So they can have different variants or alleles, and that we call heterozygous. Hetero means opposites or 2 different ones. So if you have 2 different copies of the gene, 2 different types of copies, then it's heterozygous. He also found out from his calculations that offspring get 1 allele, or let's do allele, 1 copy of the gene from each parent. So what that told him too is that each gamete, that's the word for an egg or sperm, has only 1 copy of each gene. So it would have 1 allele for each gene. And we call this idea here the law of segregation. Because remember, parents are diploid. Parents have 2 copies of every gene, or adults. So each parent has 2 copies, and the law of segregation says each gamete only gets 1 copy. He also, from his numbers, could tell that which allele is in each gamete is random. And that's called the law of independent assortment. Meaning that if the parent has 2 different copies of the allele, which one gets passed on to the offspring is random. And that's because which one is in each egg or sperm is random. Then we have these related terms here. When we talk about a genotype, that means what allele combination or combination of alleles you have. So for example, we can abbreviate those alleles. Let's say you have 1 allele we're going to call big A allele. That's the dominant allele. And with 1 allele called the little a allele, that's the recessive allele. So your genotype here would be that you're heterozygous. or big A, little a really is your genotype. Then we have another word which we call phenotype, which are the features due to the genotype. For example, your phenotype could be purple flowers. And Mendel looked at characteristics that were only caused by one gene, but many phenotypes, in fact, I'd say most phenotypes are actually due to more than one gene, all combining to make each of their effects combining to make an overall characteristic. So they can be due to one gene, the phenotype, or more than one gene. And you can remember phenotype because it's features or physical features phenotype. Genotype is the gene combo for a specific gene. So those are the 4 most important things that Mendel found out that allowed the study of genetics to really begin.